You notice it when the noise drops out of your life without warning. Not a dramatic collapse, just a quiet withdrawal. The momentum slows, the certainty dissolves, and suddenly you're standing still in a place you never planned to stop, listening to questions echo where answers used to live. At first, it hurts in a way you can't explain. You feel exposed, unproductive, behind. You scan your past for mistakes, replaying moments as if one wrong decision pushed you here. You measure yourself against lives that seem to be moving forward while yours feels paused, unfinished. And in that comparison, doubt sharpens its teeth. It tells you you're late. It tells you you've wasted time. It tells you this silence means something is wrong with you. But stay with this feeling long enough, and something begins to shift. You start to notice that the old urges don't pull the same way anymore. The things you once chased for validation now feel strangely empty. The identity you worked so hard to maintain feels heavy, like a coat you no longer need but haven't taken off yet. And that's when it becomes clear. This pause isn't about punishment. It's about separation. You're being pulled away from what you outgrew, even if you haven't yet named what comes next. This season isn't loud because it isn't meant to be shared. It's intimate. It's internal. It's the part of the journey where life stops pushing you forward and starts pulling you inward. You're being asked to sit with yourself without distractions, without applause, without a map. Not to break you, but to introduce you to a deeper alignment than motivation ever could. The waiting doesn't feel good because it's dissolving illusions. It's stripping away timelines that were never yours. It's removing borrowed definitions of success so you can feel the weight of your own truth. And yes, it's uncomfortable to stand in uncertainty without reassurance. But that discomfort is evidence that something real is rearranging inside you. One day, clarity will return. Movement will come back. And when it does, you'll realize this was not a detour. It was a threshold. You weren't lost during this silence. You were being positioned, quietly, deliberately, for a life that requires more honesty than haste. You don't notice it all at once. The silence arrives slowly, like the last sound leaving a room after a door closes. Conversations thin out. Invitations stop coming. The familiar voices that once affirmed your direction no longer reach you. And you're left alone with a quiet you didn't ask for, wondering when life decided to turn the volume down. At first, the silence feels like rejection. You question your worth. You replay old versions of yourself, trying to understand when you became less visible, less needed, less certain. You miss the feedback, the reassurance that you were doing something right. Without it, your mind fills the gaps with doubt. You start to fear that you've been overlooked, that momentum has passed you by, that growth somehow led you into isolation instead of reward. But sit in this quiet long enough, and you begin to hear something else. You notice that the noise you lost was never neutral. It carried expectations. It carried roles you learned to play. It carried versions of yourself that existed to be accepted, not to be honest. The silence didn't arrive to punish you. It arrived because those voices could no longer follow you. You didn't lose them. You outgrew the need for them. This is where growth becomes uncomfortable, because without external validation, you're forced to meet yourself directly. No audience, no applause, just the question you've avoided for years. Who are you when no one is watching? The silence presses on you not to break you, but to strip you. To loosen the identity you built to survive so something truer can take shape underneath. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the quiet stops feeling empty. It starts to feel intentional. You realize that clarity doesn't always arrive as answers. Sometimes it arrives as detachment. You're no longer pulled by what once controlled you. You're no longer shaped by noise that drowned out your own voice. This is the sacred part no one warns you about. Growth often sounds like silence, not because life has stopped speaking to you, but because it's finally giving you space to listen. And in that space, you don't disappear. You emerge, steady, grounded, and no longer dependent on echoes to know who you are. It happens without warning. One day you reach for something that once welcomed you, and your hand meets resistance. The door doesn't argue, it doesn't explain. It simply refuses to open. No conversation, no farewell, just a quiet finality that leaves you standing there, confused, staring at what used to feel like home. At first, the pain comes from not knowing. You replay every moment, searching for the reason this ending arrived unannounced. You wonder what you missed, what you failed to fix, what version of yourself wasn't enough to keep the door open. The mind demands logic, because uncertainty feels unbearable. And in the absence of answers, you turn inward, assuming the closure you never received must be your fault. But sit with that ache. Don't rush to label it as loss just yet, because some endings don't explain themselves for a reason, not to wound you, but to free you. When something leaves your life without negotiation, it's often because it has reached the limit of where it can go with you. Not everything is meant to travel the full distance. Some connections exist only to take you to a certain point, and when you arrive, they must fall away. Even if you're not ready to say goodbye. This is where the shift begins. You start to notice that what closed wasn't growing with you. It required you to shrink, to repeat old patterns, to stay familiar, rather than honest. The door didn't close because you weren't worthy. It closed because continuing would have cost you the version of yourself you're becoming. And that realization stings, because it forces you to grieve not just what ended, but what you hoped it would become. You grieve the future you imagined, the security you attached to it, the comfort of knowing what came next. But grief is not proof of failure. It is proof of investment. And investment means you showed up fully. Here is the quiet truth you weren't told. Alignment often arrives disguised as rejection. Redirection rarely feels gentle. It doesn't ask permission because if it did, fear would convince you to stay. So life closes the door for you, not as a punishment, but as protection. And one day, without ceremony, you stop reaching for that handle. Not because it stopped hurting, but because you finally understand. The path ahead requires a lighter grip on what cannot follow you. The door didn't, close to end you. It closed to keep you moving. You feel it in the moments no one sees, when you pause long enough to look around and realize the world hasn't stopped moving. It's just moving without you. Others announce milestones. Their lives seem to unfold in clear steps, while yours feels suspended, unfinished, waiting for permission that never comes. You don't say it out loud, but the thought settles in quietly. Maybe you're behind. That feeling cuts deeper than disappointment. It feels like a verdict, like time has kept score and you're losing. You replay years in your mind, measuring what you've done against what you think should have happened by now. And the stillness you're standing in begins to feel like evidence. Proof that you hesitated too long, that you lacked urgency, that something essential in you didn't move fast enough. But stillness is not absence, and it is not failure. What no one tells you is that some lives are not meant to be built into constant motion. Some are meant to be built in layers, in quiet accumulation, in depth that doesn't announce itself. The delay you resent is often a refusal to live a life that would have required you to betray your inner compass just to keep pace. You weren't slow. You were careful. You weren't stuck. You were listening. Look closer and you'll see it. While others were collecting outcomes, you were being shaped. While they were moving outward, you were moving inward, wrestling with questions that don't allow shortcuts. That work doesn't produce visible milestones, but it builds something sturdier than speed ever could. The pain comes from comparison, not from truth. You borrowed someone else's timeline and tried to measure your life against it, and when you didn't match the pace, you called it failure instead of precision. But timing is not a race. It's alignment. Arriving early to the wrong life costs more than arriving late to the right one. This is the hustle. Turning point. The moment you stop apologizing for your pace and start recognizing its purpose. You weren't being delayed. You were being protected from a version of success that would have hollowed you out, from a path that would have rewarded you publicly while costing you privately. One day, movement will come, and when it does, it will feel different. Grounded, intentional, unrushed, and in that moment, you will understand something quietly powerful. You were never left behind. You were being prepared to arrive whole. You feel it before you understand it. A weight pressing down on your chest that sleep doesn't lift and rest doesn't cure. You wake up tired not because you did too much, but because you've been holding too much for too long. Expectations, roles, obligations that crept into your life quietly and made themselves comfortable. Until one day you couldn't tell where they ended, and you began. You tell yourself this heaviness is normal, that adulthood feels like this, that responsibility always costs something. But deep down, you know this weight doesn't belong to effort. It belongs to resistance, to becoming someone you were praised for, depended on, expected to be, even when it required you to move against your own inner grain. You've been carrying versions of yourself that were built to survive, not to live. And then life starts to interfere. Things fall apart that you worked hard to hold together. Paths you committed to lose their meaning. Identities you defended no longer feel honest. And it hurts. Not just because you're losing something, but because you don't yet know who you are without it. You call it failure. You call it collapse. But what's really happening is exposure. Life is removing what you were never meant to carry past this point. This is the moment most people fight back. They tighten their grip. They double down on the weight, believing letting go means giving up. But you're beginning to see the truth in your exhaustion. The load was never proof of strength. It was proof of endurance. And endurance without alignment eventually breaks the body and numbs the spirit. So the shedding begins, slowly, sometimes painfully. You disappoint people. You disappoint old versions of yourself. You feel lighter and more afraid at the same time, because without the weight, there's no script to follow, no role to hide behind. Just you, standing exposed, unsure, and finally, honest. And then something unexpected happens. The heaviness lifts. Not all at once, but enough for you to breathe again, enough to stand without bracing yourself. What remains isn't emptiness. It's clarity. You realize the strength you were searching for was never meant to come from carrying more. It was meant to come from standing as who you are, unburdened. And in that moment, quiet but unmistakable, you understand. What felt like loss was mercy, and what's left is the self you were always meant to carry forward. You reach out in the quiet, not for comfort, but for direction. And nothing answers back. No sign. No reassurance. Just the sound of your own breath in the dark. The silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels heavy, like you've been left alone with a question too big to carry by yourself. At first, you assume you did something wrong. Maybe you didn't ask the right way. Maybe you waited too long. Maybe you're not worthy of clarity. You replay the moment again and again, hoping certainty will suddenly appear if you think hard enough. But it doesn't. The silence stays, and the waiting begins to feel personal. This is where doubt creeps in quietly. It tells you that unanswered prayers mean absence, that if guidance were truly there, it would speak louder. faster, clearer. You start leaning harder on logic, on control, on anything that gives you the illusion of certainty. Because walking without answers feels like walking without ground. But stay here long enough, and something deeper starts to reveal itself. You realize the silence isn't empty. It's steady. It's not pushing you forward or pulling you back. It's asking you to stand, to take one step without knowing where the next will land, to move without guarantees, not because you're being tested, but because you're being strengthened in a way reassurance never could. Some guidance doesn't come as instruction. It comes as endurance, as the quiet capacity to keep going without applause, without signs, without clarity. You're learning how to act without leaning on certainty, how to trust without conditions, how to remain upright when nothing explains itself, and that changes you. Because once you stop demanding answers on your timeline, you begin to feel something else take shape. A steadiness that doesn't depend on outcomes. A calm that doesn't disappear when nothing makes sense. You realize that faith, at its deepest level, isn't about hearing a voice. It's about becoming strong enough to walk when the voice goes quiet. And in that realization, the silence no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like preparation. There is a moment when nothing fits anymore. Not your old habits, not your old goals, not even the way you used to see yourself. You wake up feeling unfamiliar in your own life, like you've stepped out of one identity without having another to stand in. And the discomfort is sharp, because there's no language for it yet. Only the feeling that something has shifted, and you can't go back. This is where loneliness settles in, not because people are gone, but because no one around you recognizes the version of you that's trying to form. You question yourself constantly. You wonder if this unease means you're breaking instead of changing. You miss the certainty of who you used to be, even if that certainty was limiting. At least it was familiar. At least it gave you a script. But becoming was never meant to feel polished. This season strips you down to unfinished edges. You hesitate more. You second guess. You move slower, because you're no longer moving on instinct. You're moving with awareness. And awareness is heavy at first. It forces you to confront patterns you once ignored, truths you postponed, choices you made just to survive. It's uncomfortable because you can't unsee what you now know. Most people turn back here. They mistake discomfort for danger. They return to old versions of themselves because growth asks for patience, and patience feels like standing still in a world that rewards speed. But what's happening inside you is not collapse. It's construction. Quiet, demanding, precise. You are learning how to exist without certainty, how to tolerate not having all the answers, how to trust a direction you can't yet explain. That tension you feel, the awkwardness, the restlessness, the sense of being unfinished, is not a sign that you're lost. It's a sign that something real is taking shape beneath the surface. One day, without announcement, the pieces will begin to align. Not into the person you thought you should become, but into the person you were always becoming beneath the noise. And when that happens, you'll realize this uncomfortable season didn't delay your life. It was your life, reshaping itself from the inside out. You feel it the first time you try to step back into your old life and something inside you resists. The places that once felt grounding now feel tight. The conversations that used to flow now stall in silence. You laugh at the right moments, say the expected words, but something in you has already moved on. And that realization carries a quiet grief, not because the past was wrong, but because you can't return to it without betraying who you've become. At first, you question yourself. You wonder if you're being ungrateful, if you've changed too much, if you're abandoning parts of your life that once kept you safe. Try to force the fit. You tell yourself to adjust, to settle, to be content with what already exists. But the discomfort doesn't leave. it deepens. Because growth doesn't reverse itself to preserve familiarity. This is the part no one prepares you for. Outgrowing a life doesn't feel like victory. It feels like loss. You mourn old dreams not because they failed, but because they no longer belong to you. You miss the certainty of knowing who you were, even if that version of you was limited. You miss the ease of being understood without explanation. But ease is not the same as alignment. Slowly, the truth emerges. You were never meant to shrink yourself to fit spaces you've expanded beyond. The life that once held you can no longer contain the weight of your awareness, your honesty, your depth. Staying would require you to dim parts of yourself that finally learned how to stand in the light. And that cost is too high. So you begin to loosen your grip. Not in anger, not in regret, but with a quiet respect for what carried you this far. You stop trying to resurrect a version of yourself that no longer exists. You stop apologizing for the distance growth creates. You accept that evolution asks for separation before it offers belonging. One day, without drama, you realize something solid beneath the grief. You didn't lose your old life. You completed it, and what waits ahead is not a replacement. It's an expansion, shaped by who you've already become. There's a strange contradiction you can't explain. Everything around you feels unstable, unfinished, unresolved. Yet somewhere deep inside, something remains still. Not hopeful, not excited, just steady. And that steadiness confuses you more than the chaos itself. Your mind keeps racing ahead, demanding answers, timelines, reasons. It tells you that peace should only come after clarity, that calm should be earned once things make sense. But that's not what's happening. Instead, you feel an unexpected quiet underneath the noise, a groundedness that doesn't match the uncertainty of your circumstances. And you wonder if that calm is denial, or something deeper. You've been trained to trust anxiety more than inner peace, to believe that if you're not worried, you're not paying attention. So when fear rises and yet doesn't take control, you question yourself. You ask why you're not panicking the way you used to, why the weight hasn't crushed you the way it once did, why, even in the middle of confusion, something inside you refuses to collapse. That refusal is not accidental. There is a difference between mental noise and spiritual direction. Your mind reacts to what it cannot predict. Your spirit responds to what it recognizes as true. When the mind is unsettled but the spirit remains calm, it's often because you are standing in alignment rather than certainty. You don't know what's coming, but something in you knows you're not off course. This is the kind of clarity that doesn't speak loudly. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't argue. It simply stays, a quiet certainty that doesn't depend on outcomes or reassurance. You can feel the ground beneath you, even when the road ahead disappears into fog. That's how you know this season isn't chaos. It's positioning. You are not calm because everything is okay. You are calm because you are exactly where you need to be to become who you're meant to be. And that calm, steady, and unshakable is not ignorance. It is alignment holding you steady while the world rearranges around you. You stand at the edge of what you cannot see, and that's where the fear sharpens. Not because the path is dangerous, but because it refuses to explain itself. The ground ahead disappears into uncertainty, and your instinct begs for a map, a sign, something solid to hold before you move. Standing still feels safer than stepping into the unknown. You've been taught to trust what you can predict, to believe that clarity must come before action. So when the road doesn't reveal itself all at once, your mind fills the silence with doubt. It asks why you don't have answers yet. It questions whether moving forward without certainty is wisdom or recklessness, and you hesitate, afraid that one wrong step will undo everything you've worked to become. But pause here. Look at what's being asked of you. You are not being denied direction. You are being invited into presence. Some paths only reveal themselves through movement, not observation. If the entire road were visible, you would rush ahead without listening, without learning, without becoming. The step you're standing on now isn't small. It's precise. It is shaping how you walk, not just where you go. This is where trust deepens beyond comfort. You learn how to move without betraying your inner compass, how to take the next honest step, even when your hands are empty. You're not being asked to leap. You're being asked to remain faithful to who you are becoming, even when certainty refuses to cooperate. And something shifts when you do. The fear doesn't vanish, but it loosens its grip. You realize that progress doesn't require vision. It requires integrity. Each step forward aligns you more deeply with yourself, even when the destination remains hidden. The path begins to form beneath your feet, not ahead of them. That's when you understand the quiet truth. Faith is not knowing where you're going. Faith is moving forward anyway, and discovering that the ground appears only after you choose to step. There's a moment that comes quietly, long after the confusion has done its work. A moment when you stop arguing with the past and simply look at it. Not with regret, not with blame, just honesty, and in that stillness, something shifts. You remember how lost you felt, how every pause felt like a failure, how every detour felt like proof that you didn't know what you were doing. You thought you were wandering without direction, reacting instead of choosing, surviving instead of moving forward. The unanswered questions haunted you. The waiting exhausted you. And more than anything, you feared that you had somehow missed the life you were meant to live. But now, standing where you are, you see it differently. You see that the pauses were not empty. They slowed you down when speed would have cost you your integrity. The detours weren't mistakes. They introduced you to parts of yourself you would have never met on a straight road. The unanswered questions didn't weaken you. They forced you to build endurance, patience, and depth in places certainty never could. You weren't wandering aimlessly. You were being shaped in silence. Every season that confused you refined you. Every delay protected you from arriving somewhere you weren't ready to stand. The path didn't vanish when things stopped making sense. It narrowed. It curved. It unfolded. At a pace your soul could survive without breaking. And here's the truth that settles in slowly, almost tenderly. You couldn't have taken this journey any faster. If clarity had arrived too soon, you would have rushed past the lessons that now live inside you. If answers had come easily, you would have depended on them instead of learning how to trust yourself. You were never lost. You were being guided through a process that didn't need your understanding, only your willingness to keep going. And when you finally look back, you don't see wasted time. You see a quiet, deliberate shaping that led you exactly here, grounded, aware, and ready to walk forward as someone who knows their own depth.